In this section of working with SPSS custom tables, we're going to be looking at percentages, totals, and layers. Okay, let's return to custom tables, and we'll begin by exploring summary statistics and percentaging. Let's create a really simple table here of two categorical variables, basically a little cross tab. I'm going to cross tabulate salary grouped, which I'll put in the columns here, by age group, which I'll put in the column, put in the rows here. So one of the first things you notice when you start playing around with tables is that sometimes the summary statistics button is grayed out, and you notice it's grayed out here, so I can't access things like row percentages and table percentages when that's grayed out. But if I click on the column dimension, then it accesses it. This is called the source variable. So the source variable is actually the variable which the summary statistics are based on. It doesn't mean that I can't have row percentages. It just means that I have to click on the column dimension first and then select row percentages. The way in which that is decided within SPSS tables is either, if it's a categorical variable, the order in which it's put in. So basically the current salary defined was the first variable put into the columns dimension, so therefore the column variables become the source. If it was a scale field, then that would normally become the source, and if it's a nested variable, then the nested variable, the first nested variable, becomes the source. So there's a couple of defaults there which define it, but really just don't be too confused if you're clicking on a dimension and this gets grayed out. The other thing to bear in mind is that you can actually switch them around. You can say, well, actually I want the source variable, the source of the summary statistics be based on the row variables, not the column variables. You can switch that around there. Okay, let's talk about percentages. Let's go into summary stats here, go into summary statistics. And you notice, of course, the default is the count. Let's actually chuck that out. What else have we got? We've got lots of different confidence intervals, lower confidence interval for frequency counts, standard errors, upper confidence intervals, weighted counts. And then on row percent, there's lots of different types of percentages, far too many to go into. But you can have things like valid percent, which is obviously a bit like a valid percent in a frequency table, which the percentage is based on valid values, i.e. excluding missing values. And you have, of course, down here you have column percent, and we'll talk about layers later on, but layer percent just means a third variable which splits the table up. And table percent down here, if I ask for table percent n percent and put that in, that's basically a kind of total percent. It just reflects the frequency of cases within the table. So, you know, the largest group is this group down here, which is 30 to 44. They've got the largest frequency count because they make up 11% of that table. So it's 30 to 44 in the $37,051 and above bracket. Okay, so if I go back here and click on custom tables and say, okay, well, look, actually I'm not really interested in that. What I want is the row percent. Chuck that in. I'll obviously change the label here, so I don't want row n percent, I want something a bit more descriptive. Row percent, it's got one decimal place in it. Okay, I'm happy with that. I click apply to selection, hit close, and if I click OK at that point, there's my row percent coming out. It isn't necessarily obvious to people it's row percent unless they read it, and oddly enough the label for row percent is in the columns, which maybe is a bit strange for people. So just again be aware that the position of the summary statistic label is in columns. You can switch that to rows. Click OK, put the rows, now row percent in the rows. So you can play around with these things, or perhaps you think, actually I don't actually need a label like row percent. I can put that into the title and hit hide. If I hide it and it doesn't appear, maybe I redo it and then say okay, give it a title and say it's age group by salary band, row percent, something like that. So it's just to bear in mind that you have control over the summary statistics labeling, where it appears and what dimension the summary statistic is based on. Okay, let's turn our attention now towards creating tables that are based on, that include things like totals and subtotals. To do so, let's just return to custom tables. I'm just going to reset everything so we start again from scratch. And this time I'm going to pick a different variable to go into the rows dimension. I'm going to pick employment category. I'm putting in the rows dimension, and I'm going to put actually age group across the columns dimension. Notice that employment category now becomes the source variable, because it's in the first one I added in there. And if I just want to switch on totals, of course I can click on categories and totals. I can ask for totals here from the row dimension. There's a total added in there, and I can ask for a total from the column dimension. So totals aren't affected by which one is the source variable. Click OK at that point. We just get 2 totals added in there. Now, if I go back to this, just something to bear in mind is that you can actually play around with the totals by click on the column dimension here. You can choose whether or not they include things like empty categories. You can choose the labeling, and an interesting convention is that some people prefer to have the total be the first column or the first row that is defined rather than at the end of the rows or the end of the columns. And there's also a convention, particularly in market research, to label it as the base. So I hit apply there. I've created a table. Here's the total. It's been moved to the first column position, and it's actually labeled as base. Down here at the bottom, it's still called total. So that's interesting. You can actually play around with that. The other thing to bear in mind is you can actually create subtotals. So if I went in here and clicked on this dimension here, let me just remove, so it doesn't get too confusing, remove the column total there. Let's go into the rows here and click on categories and totals. I've got clerical, custodial, managers. So basically the clerical and custodial workers, they are non-managers. So you could actually put in a subcategory. You just need to say where the subcategory is going to go, and add a total to that and say add subtotal. So I could call this non-managers. Hit continue. And notice also that when you edit this, you can say hide subtotal categories from table. Hit continue. So now clerical and custodial have gone. So it's almost like we've collapsed them together. That's interesting. Click on that. Now you just have non-managers and manager. So that's an interesting way for us to play around with it. There's other stuff we can do in totals, like add our own categories in there and use it some sort of computed expression. That's particularly useful if you've got, if you want to look at the difference between two groups or something like that, the delta, if you like. So you can create a little expression in there, particularly useful if you've got things like continuous or scale variables in there. So some richness to explore with regard to totaling. That may not be obvious if you're just playing around with the software itself. Okay, let's turn our attention now. Let's hit reset and turn our attention to this concept of layers, which you notice it mentions layers here and layering. So if I just explain that to you, if I put in, again, let's do current salary by age group. I'll put age group across the top this time. Doesn't really matter. I'll add in, just for the fun of it, some things like total experience, and ask for the mean of that and previous experience, that kind of thing, just to give us a bit more room to play around with different measures. And I'm going to define a layer dimension. So a layer dimension is basically a third dimension. If I add in gender and put that and say that's my layer variable, click OK. What you notice is the table looks kind of the same as you would expect, but it says very subtly here, gender female. And that's because layered tables or pivot tables in SPSS can be drilled. You can drill down into them, so you can click on them, call one value up after another. If you add in another layer variable, so I could add in, say, minority class here, so whether or not they're an ethnic minority, let me just add that onto the end of that group. Click OK. Now it says gender female, or I could have minority yes, so I could see the minority groups, but they're independent of one another. These layer controls are independent of one another. They're not combinations of male and female, or whether or not they are a minority or not. If I wanted that, if I wanted to combine these two, layer variables together, then I'd switch on show each combination of categories as a layer, click OK. Particularly useful, of course, if you've got a really big table of many different categories and you don't want it to be overwhelm the user, overwhelm the viewer with all of these different categories. Maybe it's region, or maybe it's a year or something like that. Double click on it, and here we have, of course, every combination of that with female minority classification no, female minority classification yes, male minority classification no, and male minority classification yes.